session of CME Palooza Spring 2016. I am Scott Palooza, co-producers, and thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. I am pleased to be getting CME Palooza Spring kicked off with our first session entitled More Than Just a Lit Summary, Using Compelling Data in Grant Requests to Support Practice Gaps and Clinician Educational Needs. And this session is sponsored by Helio.com Education Lab. So before we begin this session, I would certainly like to acknowledge and thank all the sponsors of CME Palooza Spring. Our sponsor Genentech, our silver sponsors Practice Exchange, Platform Q Health Education, Helio.com Academy Front ASI Consulting, Photograph Ed, Impact Education, Highmark CE, Educational Measures, CMEology, Clinical Care Options, and the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning. So there are three ways to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza spring sessions. You can use the Practicing Clinicians Exchange text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME, so that's 0263. You can click on the Google Plus Q&A link located at the bottom of each video, or you can tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag, and we will be chiming in throughout this and every session with questions that come in from our audience. So just a very brief speaker disclosure slide, just to make sure that everyone understands that all the comments of our presenters during this session are their own opinions and not an endorsement or position of their employers. And so with that, I am going to turn things over to Dr. Monique Johnson from MiMedx to get this session underway.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you could join us, and we're very pleased, Audrey, Turneau, and I, to be doing the first session of CME Palooza Spring. I'm going to jump right in, and we're again talking about how to maximize your literature summary, your literature searching, and in order to develop a good needs assessment to support very excellent grant proposals. So I put this slide in because I really wanted to set the stage of how we should get our minds thinking before we even jump into what sources to seek out to find information about the gaps we're looking for. And really, I go back to 2,000 years ago when Aristotle and all of the other scholars were around the forum talking. One of the big topics, one of the big strategies they used was persuasion. And so I wanted to point you to the three different strategies that are used to get the art of persuasion going, which are ethos, logos, and pathos. Of course, ethos is how the speaker is perceived by the audience. And then I'll go to pathos, which is appealing to the emotional part of the audience. And then the one we're going to really talk about now is logos, which is making the logical argument and using good, solid data and rhetoric in some cases to appeal to the audience by making sure that they understand the argument and they will jump on board with what you're trying to propose. So I will say grant proposals are really persuasive writing documents, and if you have that in mind, it will help forward and make writing needs assessments and doing proposals easier and make you excel in that area. So I'm calling this getting your logos on. So in order to develop these logical arguments, Audrey and I are now going to review several different kinds of sources that you probably have tapped in the future, may not have tapped as successfully as you'd liked, and can give you tips on how to do that better. And then maybe even some novel sources that you hadn't thought of before and how to use those. We're going to talk about things from learners, from the clinical experts, and from patients.
Well, perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. Monique, I don't know what could possibly be more persuasive than history. So being that it was never my favorite subject in school, I know there's something to be said for historical data, and we all have it. Historical data is collected in our prior educational activities, and that's a starting block which providers should be using and incorporating into their needs assessments. And you might ask, which data? My favorite part of a live presentation is Q&A. It's fast and it's loaded with insight because it's the pressing information that our learners are dying to get at, and it's their opportunity to ask about something that really matters to them. So when learners are actively seeking information, they're demonstrating a need. So one way we would say is pay close attention at a live activity that you're doing to what's being asked during Q&A. Now, another strong source of data being provided by your target audience are their pre-post questions. A question with minimal change pre-post, it's going to let you know that that specific area really can use some extra attention and education driven towards it. Now, just to be clear, you definitely want to make sure that you have vetted that the question was not confusing first, that you identified the correct answer, and that the delivery of content is clear. But once you've checked all of those, use those small changes from pre to post to help you identify that next area that could be the start of a new educational intervention. What about evaluation data? There are a lot of educational areas that you may ask about, those open-ended questions. What other areas of education would be beneficial to you in your practice or to your patients? So over the course of time, if you review answers given to you in those open-ended questions from a specific target audience, you're going to start to see what they'd like to be learning about next. Although we understand deciphering handwriting can be a little challenging. And how about those lovely pie charts? We've all got them, and they're going to come out of the specialty and profession responses we get from our learners. Now, when you're analyzing data from a past activity, there can be a moment of concern. You know that pie chart? When the slice of the pie under other starts to get too large, we can kind of panic a little bit because why is this audience or this group of learners now coming to my activity? What you don't know is you just may have uncovered an unexpected subset of learners who want to participate and learn. So they might drive the education you already have towards a new group of learners. So these are all building blocks. Now, the slide that Scott has up for us is about survey data. It's another great source for us to look at. This is a little bit of data from a survey that we sent out to chronic pain patients and their clinicians. We were of the understanding that there might be some communication barriers. So we asked both sides, were they confident in their ability to communicate? And as you can see, they all felt that they were. When we go to the next slide, we've now got the question specifically posed to the clinicians. We asked them, and you can actually go one more, Scott. It'll be green bars. Yes, thank you. We asked, how often to the clinicians do you ask your patients about elements of their pain? Based on these self-reported results from a survey, clinicians are asking all the time. But what we're going to encourage you to do is think a little bit outside the box and don't send your survey to only one segment of learners. Because when you go to the next slide, we also ask the same question of the patients of those clinicians. And what ended up happening was a slightly different story being told. See, somewhere between always and never, there definitely is a communication gap. And what survey data can help you uncover when you incorporate different perspectives is that the things just may not be either as clear as you'd hope them to be, or perhaps truly something in the practice is just not happening. And in this case, we can definitely identify that the communication challenge is there. One more slide forward, and we're going to just cover a few other sources of data. We've talked about surveys. Consider control groups, a group of learners who perhaps pre-registered for a live activity and answered pretest questions, but did not actually participate in the live event. You can utilize them as a control group. Ask them some post-test questions and see if their learning changed. It'll help you gauge whether or not that target audience is being impacted by education that's ongoing, or if that target audience continues to need further education. You can work alongside with either focus groups or patient advocacy groups. There may be survey or group data that is already out there, or we would encourage you to partner with them to uncover additional data. There are national guidelines. And clearly, national guidelines can be impacted by the age of the guidelines. Are they several years old, and do they incorporate all current therapeutic options? If they are new, they've just become a knowledge gap in which education needs to be disseminated. You may find data out there that's already published, so you don't always have to start from square one. Then you've got your key or thought leaders or subject area experts, and they can be very insightful in helping guide and navigate you through the complexity of a particular disease state, and then help you uncover the succinct need that you can actually address for your audience. You've got national health outcomes, or it could just be a new skill that needs that has recently emerged into the healthcare arena, and basic knowledge is out there. All of these are excellent sources that you should be considering pulling when you're working on the development of a needs assessment.
Great, great. Thanks, Audrey. That's awesome, and I want to echo that. I do certainly think that anything that is new or newer that the target audience doesn't know yet, again, I agreed wholeheartedly, is a implicit gap just because it's new to the person that needs to learn it or know it or be competent at doing it. I'm going to look now at the next couple of slides, which are going to focus on published practice gaps, and the gem word in that is published. I remember when I became a medical writer and writing needs assessments, I would find, I would know things and people would tell me things, but I would say, why doesn't someone put this pen to paper and publish this? Well, the good news is people are starting to, and that's really good news for us, because now we don't have to say we know there's a gap. We can say it's published here and cite it, which is all the more, it makes it stronger. So I'm going to go through a couple of tips and tools about published practice gaps and where you can find them. The first one is in any kind of state of the state report that comes out either from the government, a governmental office, or a specialty society. I'm going to use examples, of course, from the therapeutic area I most deal in, which is oncology, but I'm sure you'll find these kinds of reports in several specialties. And I just want to point you to the things I've underlined, which are very, it can't be stated any more on point regarding what we want in a needs assessment than this. Difficult for clinicians to remain up to speed. They may prematurely abandon a therapy before they give it enough time to work. Definitely a gap explicitly stated. And then the wow sentence at the end, additional clinical education will be necessary. So not only has this report talked about gaps and pointed them out specifically, but it's actually said the solution is education, which is just exactly what we're looking for. The next slide is, again, practice guidelines, which Audrey mentioned as well. I want to point you to that the AMA PCPI actually has in each of them a section called Statistics on Current Practice, and it points to actual statistics, where someone has done a study, and you can pull that data to show there's a gap, and I mean in terms of actual numbers. So of course 14%, 50% are not numbers we want to be achieving in medicine. We want all patients to get the best care. So when you see numbers below 90, there certainly is the rationale for there's a gap there. The next published practice gap would be, the next slide, Scott, sorry, is a pearl that I've uncovered. I use mesh terms quite a bit to make my PubMed searches very specific, and there is actually a mesh term that will hone you down to, when coupled with your therapeutic area mesh term, such as oncology or breast cancer or whatever it would be, when you couple practice patterns, physicians as a mesh term with your mesh term that represents the therapeutic area, you will pull published surveys and reports that are pointing out that a practice pattern is existing and maybe how ideal that practice pattern is compared to what we want it to be, which is the ideal. And then the next one would be, of course, and I want to give kudos to colleagues in the CME world. We are actually publishing surveys as well, and so I want to make sure that you know that you should be looking for our group, CME providers and professionals, to start publishing more on gap analysis or needs assessment surveys that we find. I'm pointing you to the first one is a poster that was presented at the Alliance and that was by Christine Stone from Haymarket. And that was quite involved and helpful. And then colleagues, myself and colleagues, and as well as a faculty at my company also have done several editorials to kind of get the audience of learners aware that there is a gap. Because sometimes the biggest hurdle is convincing the learner that they have the gap in the first place. So we did that to try to unravel or show that there is a gap and get the target audience on board as well. And then, of course, Cardi's really mentioned this already, talking to your experts. Any faculty that you've worked with before are more than happy generally to help you think through some ideas, tell you if they think there's a gap for a specific learner cohort that you're trying to get. Certainly include those quotes in your needs assessment if they give a quote that really gets right on target. And of course, the newsreels coming out of live meetings often have a lot of commentary that folks are sharing based on what they just heard at a live meeting. Those are excellent quotes to include in your needs assessment if it pertains to something that might represent a gap. And then the last thing, which is a newer area I've gotten into recently, is, of course, the patient voice. We know that's very important in CME, becoming more focused on, certainly is the crux of why we're doing all this. And so, certainly talk to patients when you can. We sometimes do patient video clips in CME, so that's a chance to talk to patients. But even if you can't talk to patients, that are in your therapeutic area. We all have family members, we all have friends, neighbors. Talk to them if they can provide insight. And then, of course, it takes a lot of time, it's a lot of data mining, but patient forums are chocked with lots of comments from patients that suggest that perhaps their physician could do better with counseling, communication, as Audrey proved in that very remarkable bar graph. So if you find things that point to gaps from patient forums, they are perfectly fine to include in the needs assessment.
So I want to thank Monique for setting that up so fabulously, because now we'd like to just walk you through some best practices and pearls that were communicated from some commercial supporters who are on the receiving end of these needs assessments. So I'd like to, while they will remain anonymous, thank you so much for their efforts and helping us to be able to share with you some of the highlights of things that they see that make compelling needs assessments, and on the other hand, some things that they look out for which could be pitfalls in your needs assessments and are very easily remedied once you're aware that they are looking for these things that really can be improved upon. So in terms of some best practices, having a story weaved throughout your needs assessment, helping define the unmet need, is something that may help your needs assessment stand out. Or the incorporation of population health data that is relevant to the context of the identified gaps. Again, keeping things very focused. You've got strategic use of graphics and text used to where appropriate. As you can see earlier, sometimes it could be a much longer story to tell, but a simple bar chart expressing the difference between what everyone thinks is going on, the visual impact can be outstanding. And I think in CME we're also incorporating the use a lot more of infographics in our content. It's time to take that back and incorporate that into our needs assessments as well. We have educational and practice gaps for the audience, which the education is being designed. Again, education being designed is wonderful. Making sure that it is as targeted as possible to the right audience is crucial. And support that you've identified the correct audience. Sometimes not just access to an audience makes it appropriate, but really drilling down to their role within the healthcare provider team and seeing how the education can impact their role and then designing for it specifically. These are a few. On the next slide, we also have objectives that align with either clinical or non-clinical role of those healthcare professionals in caring for a patient with a specific disease state. Again, broad learning objectives often allow us to cover a good spectrum of information in education, but don't be afraid of being targeted and purposeful with your education. Educational assessment of the needs. Make sure that your objective assessment is there. Information that we're talking about from all of these different sources, you want to make sure that you're tying it all together and it's telling a cohesive story. The identification of how the need is going to be addressed. It isn't enough to say that toddlers need to learn how to tie their shoes. We need to also turn around and say how we are going to help them learn how to tie their shoes. Sorry, I always throw in the kid reference. We've also got multiple sources of information. So a strong needs assessment is going to include multiple ones. Everything that Monique and I have just shared with you are a large variety, and they are definitely not the only ones out there. Make sure your needs assessment is built on a multi-pronged approach. And then alignment with therapeutic areas of interest. If you are seeking support for your education, make sure it is of value and matters to the individuals you are requesting that from. Not to end on a downer, but I like to look at any pitfalls that have been identified as areas for growth. And if you are not doing any of these, then you're in great shape, but just keep them in mind. Multiple requests in the same disease state for different audiences, all with the same learning objectives. Learning objectives need to be uniquely crafted. Ensure that you are doing that in your requests. Make sure that your needs assessments are lengthy enough. It's scary to think that there might be a needs assessment that could be 2 sentences long, especially when we're talking about a multi-pronged approach to bringing all of this information together. It really, the more robust information that you incorporate, the stronger that persuasive argument you're making will be. Needs assessments that don't match the learning objectives can be cause for concern. Also, just a list of sources, not the actual needs. Or perhaps a literature review only of the needs of the learners. Again, one source does demonstrate the potential for a need, but in terms of validating it, you really do need to substantiate what you are saying is an educational need with more than one perspective. Old, outdated literature sources as opposed to more recent references can also be a challenge. You need to ensure that you are keeping time and tempo with the ever-changing environment in which we're working in. So a published piece of literature from 6 months ago may now be outdated already. It's definitely driven like technology. What works today may not work tomorrow. A lack of references or claims that go towards an unmet gap. They need to be from substantiated and qualified sources. How about a general reference section just at the end of the proposal? Can't say we're designing for education and at the end of the proposal will just be a list of references. We need to connect the dots and tell the story throughout our needs assessment of why that education is needed. We also need to make sure that we've got complete data, because incomplete data will not reflect strongly on the education that we're ultimately going to deliver. And the last one would be poor editing, to ensure that you're doing a QC of your final pieces and making sure that there aren't misspellings or incorrect terminology, or perhaps run-on sentences with no visual cues. All of these things would help you make the strongest case possible for education.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple questions that have come in. We've got a few minutes. We've got about 5 minutes here. So Audrey, this first one's for you. So regarding your example of posing the same question to clinicians and the clinicians' patients to determine potential communications gaps, via how often are you asked about elements of pain during a routine visit? What method is used in facilitating asking this question to the clinician's patients? In other words, how do you gain access to the clinician's patients to ask this question and obtain their side of the story for feedback?
Well, I'm going to throw out there first, if you're working in a quality improvement area, having the buy-in of the healthcare clinicians, perhaps working with a smaller group of them and asking for feedback from their patients is definitely one. And I'm not saying that there aren't obstacles to doing that, because clearly there are, but that definitely is one way. Another way is reaching out through your patient advocacy groups and reaching out to the patients there, asking them to share the survey with their clinicians. Or you can go ahead and send it out based on demographics to a particular, and of course not as succinct as matching up the individual patients and their clinicians, but just as valid data can be collected if you have information from the target audience group of the healthcare professionals and patients who seek healthcare in that area, even if it's not a matched set. And I'm not statistically sure that that's the exact way to reference it, but that information, when you put it side by side, will demonstrate things such as a national gap. I scared him. Oh.
Okay, great. So Monique, you kind of offered a number. You offered a number of Monique.
Yes, I'm here. Is it better now?
Yes, there you go.
Sorry. Yeah. I did not hear your question.
That's
I
okay.
apologize.
Okay, so you presented a number of different options of places where people can look for information to help build their needs assessment. So which ones do you personally find the most persuasive or powerful?
I personally find that if I look at clinical guidelines, not particularly the listing of recommendations that come from them, but the background, they've always done some kind of background summary of, hey, we collected all this information and this is what came out of it. They often will have lots of very powerful information about that. I also find a lot of information, especially to get me started on what the gaps may be, from looking at, and this is specific to my therapeutic area, the American Society of Clinical Oncology newsreels, where they do lots of interviews on-site at meetings where they catch people in the hall and say, what do you think about what was just presented? So reactions to data about new things is very, very useful. So I look at I start with a lot of clinical expert opinions, commentary that's published either in a video format on the internet, and then go from there. Now that's given that you have a good understanding of the background issues in your therapeutic area. But to get to the nitty-gritty of what people feel about new data, how competent and confident they feel in implementing it in practice, is it ready to implement in practice yet or not? I get a lot of information from online sources like videos of interviews of clinical experts.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much both to Monique and Audrey for a very engaging kickoff session. So for folks who are watching this either live or after the fact, there is a survey that we have up on the live tab of the CME Palooza Spring website. So certainly we encourage everyone to complete that survey. We are actually giving away a handful of Amazon gift cards to people who provide their email addresses if they choose to. And to view the next session, you will need to refresh your browser once we shut down this session here in a moment, and we will start the next session momentarily. So thank you once again to Audrey and Monique, and we will see everyone in a few minutes.